Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the 22nd installment of my Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links Best Deck series. Today I'm going to be showing you a mill deck known as Shadow Game. So just a couple of things before the video starts. First of all, this deck is very similar to a Teo mill deck, but I'd say it's a definitely weaker version of a Teo mill deck, so I'd say this deck's more for casual players rather than competitive climbing players. It does win games, but it's going to be a lot harder to climb with this deck than just playing the standard Teo mill deck. And secondly, I'm sorry for the late upload. I was visiting a convention up in Adelaide last week, so I didn't get to do an upload that week, and also I've been trying to work out a bunch of moving stuff. And without further ado, let's get into the video. Alright, so the best character for this deck, and the only character for this deck, is Yami Marik, with the skill Shadow Game. At the end of their respective turn, each player will lose life points equal to 100 times the number of cards in their graveyard. Already, just from reading the ability, you should know what this deck's going to be about. It's going to be all about putting cards in your opponent's deck into their graveyard so that you can do damage to them. The only thing I'm going to mention before I move on is that this skill isn't just going to damage your opponent. Keep in mind, it's going to damage you as well. So just keep that in mind when you're having your turn, not to accidentally kill yourself. Alright, now I'll go through the deck list. The deck list for this deck is 3 Warm Worm, 3 Jowls of Demise, 3 Hiro Shadow Scout, 1 Gokipon, 3 Assault on GHQ, 3 a Feint Plan, 2 Skull Innovation, 1 Coffin Seller, and 1 Windstorm of Etaqua. So already you can probably see the similarities between this deck and a Teo mill deck. Basically the only real difference is the Skull Innovation and the Coffin Seller, as both decks do exactly the same thing. They're both trying to mill your opponent. If you don't know what milling is, it's pretty much an old Magic the Gathering term for making your opponent draw a bunch of cards until they have no cards left in their deck. And when your opponent has no cards left in their deck, they lose the game when they try to draw a card. With this deck, there are a few cards that are pretty interchangeable. The only cards you really need to keep are Warm Worm, the Hiro Shadow Scout, the Assault on GHQ, the Jowls of Demise, and everything else after that is pretty interchangeable. If for some reason you only have a one of a few of these cards, or if you only have two ofs, or if you just don't have any at all, most of them can be replaced with just adding in an enemy controller or a Sphere Karibo or something like that, as that continues to delay the game, which is pretty much what half the cards in this deck do anyway, such as the Windstorm of Etaqua or Feint Plans. Alright, now I'll go through the strategy behind the deck and how exactly these cards work together. So basically this is how the deck will run. You'll play your mill monsters, which will either take cards from your opponent's deck and put them in the graveyard, or it will make your opponent draw cards. You'll combine those monsters with Assault on GHQ, which selects one monster on your side of the field, destroys that card, and makes your opponent send 2 cards on top of their deck to the graveyard. And that little combination right there is how you win most of your games. That is your first win condition, which is making your opponent draw all of his cards so he has 0 cards left in the deck, which then when he tries to draw a card, he'll get a deck out loss. Now obviously, these cards alone will not actually win you a game, as without having cards to help delay the game further, you'll find that your opponent will just hit you in the face and you'll keep losing life points real quick, and you'll lose in the first 3 turns before you can actually make them deck out. So to combine with these monsters and Assault on GHQ, you have cards like Jowls of Demise and a Feint Plan, which is a combination of delay monsters and delay traps to make the game go on as long as possible till you can make your opponent run out of cards in his deck. The final part to the strategy of this deck is the burn part. Basically this is why you took the skill Shadow Game, as that does damage to your opponent and to you based on how many cards are in their graveyard / your graveyard. So combining the skill with cards such as Skull Innovation, which do damage based on whenever your opponent sends a card to the graveyard, you can quite often just kill your opponent with burn damage. So if you didn't understand the strategy for this deck, don't worry, there will be 3 gameplays I believe at the end of this video, maybe 5 depending on how much recording and how long the video is after I've done the recording, and that'll pretty much give you a rough idea of how to play the deck out anyway. But for now I'm going to go through each of the monster cards individually and each of the trap cards individually in the deck, so that you understand how exactly each of the cards work and special interactions they have, such as Jewels of Demise and Assault on GHQ. First of all, I'll start with the monster cards. The first 2 monster cards in this deck are your mill cards. What Warm Worm does is when it is destroyed, it sends the top 3 cards of your opponent's deck to the graveyard. And what Hero Shadow Scout does is when it flips, your opponent draws 3 cards, both players look at the cards, and if there are any spell cards among them, discard those spell cards to the graveyard. So there's 2 main differences with these cards. First of all, one is a destroy effect, the other is a flip effect. And the second is, one is a send effect and the other is a draw effect. Both of these things are really important to keep track of as they really affect your deck when you're using it. So when you're using the card Assault on GHQ, which is a destroy effect, it destroys one monster on your side of the field and sends 2 cards from the top of your opponent's deck to the graveyard, it will only really work well with Warm Worm, as if you use it on Hero's effect won't be activated as it's a flip effect. And the other important reason why draw effects are important compared to send effects is obviously 1 is going to make your opponent draw cards, and 2, if it's the very last, if your opponent is down to his last 2 cards and you have heroes on the board, if he swings at it and its effect activates, he will lose the game. But if he swings at a Warm Worm, and it will only send 2 cards to the graveyard and it won't make him lose the game because it won't make him try and draw another card, whereas heroes will try to make him draw that 3rd card which he does not have. If you didn't understand a word of what I just said, don't worry, just look at the gameplays at the end of the video. They'll pretty much show both of these cards in action, or you can just try them out for yourself. It doesn't take much practice to know how exactly these cards work and what situations to use them. The only other thing to mention about these cards is you're always going to be placing them face down defense position, as they have weak stats, so they're only going to be used as a blocker. Gokipon is in this deck basically because I didn't believe there were enough monster cards in the deck yet. There wasn't a good enough balance of trap to monsters, and I'd always find myself drawing a bunch of trap cards in a row and never getting enough monsters in my starting hand. Basically all Gokipon does is acts as another way of getting Warm Worm in your hand. What it does is when your opponent destroys it, it allows you to draw 1 insect type monster with 1500 or less attack from your deck to your hand, which, conveniently, is exactly the stats Warm Worm is. Jowls of Dark Demise has 2 reasons to be in the deck. First of all, it can delay the game for an entire turn, and the second reason is when it's combined with Assault on GHQ, it can be used as removal. What it does is when it is flipped, it takes control of 1 monster your opponent controls until the end of the turn it is activated. So basically when your opponent tries to attack you, all you need to do is take control of their highest attack monster and their battle phase is done. They can no longer attack you anymore, as they don't really want to destroy their own monster, nor can they actually do it without having to activate a bunch of trap cards or anything like that. Now I'll talk about the removal part more when I get around to Assault on GHQ, as what that does is it basically destroys a monster you control, so once you take control of one of their monsters you can destroy it, but I'll talk more about that when I get around to that card. The last thing to really note about Jowls of Dark Demise is the monster it takes control of can attack your opponent's life points directly, so during your turn, if there is a Jowls of Dark Demise face down, you can flip it, take control of one of their monsters, and hit them in the face. But quite often I don't recommend this, as this deck doesn't deal with your opponent's backline at all, so anything like Miracles, Spear Karibos, enemy controllers, Windstorm of Etaqua, all those cards, this deck doesn't have any way of dealing with them, it just ignores them. So I prefer to use this card as defensively as possible and not really offensively. Alright, now I'll go through the trap cards in this deck. The first card is Assault on GHQ. Basically, this card is your only milling trap card. What it does is it selects 1 monster on your side of the field to activate this card. You destroy the selected card and send 2 cards from the top of your opponent's deck to the graveyard. So your main 2 targets for this will be the monsters you steal using Jowls of Dark Demise and your Warm Worms. Basically, when you steal a card using your Jowls of Dark Demise and you activate your Assault on GHQ on it, it will destroy that monster, send it to his graveyard, and send 2 cards from the top of his deck to the graveyard, which will proc a ton of abilities that you have with all your trap cards that do damage based on cards in graveyard and cards being sent to the graveyard, as well as your ability. All of which whilst destroying your opponent's most powerful monster. And the reason you target Warm Worm with this is because it's a destroy effect, so it will just destroy Warm Worm and activate its ability. You don't have to always activate it on Warm Worm if you just want to leave Warm Worm on the board as a defender, so it'll probably be destroyed anyway when your opponent swings at it. But if it's close to the end of the game, your opponent only has 5 cards left in their deck, you can always just activate it, send 2 cards from top of their deck to the graveyard, as well as 3 cards from Warm Worm, swap to their turn, so when they draw a card, they lose the game. The next 2 cards perform the exact same function, just slightly differently. Skull Invitation, what that does is each time a card is sent to the graveyard, inflicts 300 damage to the owner of the card sent. So the thing to keep in mind with this is it will work on you and your opponent, so you may not want to kill yourself using Skull Invitation, as that will probably be a bad idea. Coffin Seller, on the other hand, doesn't do damage to you, but it has a downside, which is it only works on monster cards sent to the graveyard. So unlike Skull Innovation, when your opponent sends a card to the graveyard, it will only do 300 damage based on the amount of monster cards that are sent, not just every card in general. So in a way the card is weaker, but it's also a bit safer. It was hard to see whether or not the downside of this card was enough to say it was worse than Skull Innovation, so I've just been having it in the deck to kind of trial it out anyway. And I'm sure you can see that with all the interactions and monster cards and the Assault on GHQ in this deck, how these 2 cards really impact the game and make your opponent constantly lose life points. Most of the time this deck will be a very slow and painful way for your opponent to die. Feint Plan and Windstorm of Etaqua perform the exact same role in this deck, as basically both of them are aimed at delaying 1 turn. When your opponent activates the battle phase or is about to go into the battle phase, you can just activate a Feint Plan, which stops your opponent attacking face down monsters during this turn. And if they are unable to attack your face down monsters, they are also unable to hit your life points, therefore you can just waste a turn as soon as you activate this card. And Windstorm of Etaqua, when your opponent attacks, you can activate it, send each of their cards into defense position, therefore stopping them attacking. Well guys, that's pretty much it for this deck guide. Stick around if you want to see the gameplay of this deck and see it in action. But otherwise, thank you guys for watching. Like, subscribe, all that kind of stuff, and I hope to see you in the next one.